We're really all stakeholders in disability rights. Obviously, the physically, mentally, and learning disabled are stakeholders. Their families are stakeholders. They have to take care of them. Most of us, because we could become disabled anytime in life, and society as a whole, both because we lose out on everything that the disabled have to offer them, because we're ethically obligated to provide basic rights and care for everybody. Everybody has worth, and because businesses will lose out on many of their talents and abilities, and they'll do jobs that other people don't necessarily always want to do. Part of the problem in the treatment of this disabled is that society is biased against them. Historically, they've been biased all along. People have always looked at the disabled as somehow sometimes being deserving of what happened to them, that it's a punishment or something like this. And even today, we don't realize their abilities, their needs, their feelings, so that we don't enable as much independence and autonomy as possible, and we don't allow them to realize their potential and their needs for things such as love and intimacy. Disabled suffer many inequities and injustices. They can't get around. There's lack of access to transit systems and public places, such as restaurants, public spaces, museums, all kinds of things. Sometimes they'll have to go in through the back door or not be able to get in at all. Employment, it's much harder for them to get a job. Even if they are hired, they're often paid less. And they may have to take a job that they're overqualified for, so that means they are making less than they're actually capable of making. It's quite obvious that they would have high medical costs because of their conditions, which also is another economic drain. They're extremely susceptible to housing insecurity and homelessness, partly because people don't want to rent to them, partly because they don't have the money for it. There's a very high rate of poverty because of all of this. They have a high risk of being mistreated or abused, partially because people who are taking care of them might get frustrated with them, partially because they're powerless. Maybe their caregivers think that they won't be able to let other people know that they're being abused or mistreated. And there's a lack of inclusion, which is extremely important, since this lack of inclusion makes them feel bad. It gives them a lower self-concept, and this is actually being tied to a lot of the bad effects of being disabled, and a lot of their conditions such as anxiety and depression, bad self-esteem, self-image, self-affect that they can suffer from. Discrimination is important to society and some of the consequences. Well, basically, society loses out on all the disabled can contribute if given the chance, as well as the contributions of their caregivers who can't work because they're caring for them. So the caregivers now can't go to work, can't lead their lives. Another major concern is who will care for them when their family or their caregiver gets old and dies. Their responsibility of society, who will then have to assume their care and take care of them. This is going to be an expense and a time drain and everything, because sometimes they do need some care. And here are some of the famous people with disabilities that we would miss out on all their contributions if we hadn't accepted them. Sometimes we probably did not know, in the case of most of them, that they had disabilities, but imagine how much poorer our world would be without them. An important concern is that the lack of basic infrastructure, aside from not letting the disabled get around and go where they need to go, and even hold jobs easily because they can get to them. Aside from that, this lack of infrastructure, together with inadequate disaster response, makes it difficult and even sometimes prevents the disabled from being able to evacuate or stay safe in case of a disaster, and it can lead even to injury and death, as Hemingway and Priestley pointed out. Work should care because we have a primary mission to pay particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty, and because we have a mission to promote social change by working towards policy development and implementation on a local and national level for those who can't do it for themselves. What can we do? We can work to make the ADA Act more enforceable. It actually has a lot of protections, but it's very hard to enforce, and it's easy for companies to get out of listening to it. We can develop and implement policies to promote inclusion, lobby for change in housing availability, more inclusive housing, better mental health and therapy, and medical insurance and service availability with better coverage, advocate for and devise more programs, especially for disabled adults who are provided for even less than children. These can be educational and vocational programs, respite care, so their caretakers can have a break and do what they need to do, daycare, again, so they have something to do and their caregivers can get out, group homes, transitional planning, what do you do when they get older and they age out of the public school system. And we, very importantly, should educate the public of the worth and the ability of the disabled and how much they. One way to ignite interest and change stereotypes associated with people with disabilities is to recognize and shine light on their abilities. Please view the video below in your spare time to see a young disabled model walk in one of the world's most prestigious fashion shows. And another example of igniting interest by exposure. Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio as an adult, disabling him and placing him in a specially designed wheelchair to get around. This shared experience and a subsequent understanding of the challenges faced by those afflicted with polio led him to create the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. By 1938, it had already become known as the March of Dimes, which is how we know it today. Can start early in igniting interest. If we introduce children to other children with disabilities within their school setting, that's inclusion. Inclusion secures opportunities for students with disabilities to learn alongside their non-disabled peers in general education classrooms, and here's a link. Some modification can be needed, but this will also be a lesson for the other children to learn empathy and that everybody is human and how much people with disabilities can do and how similar they are to themselves, much like inclusion when people get older in other areas. Social workers can help. We can educate and advocate the disabled themselves, their families, the public, the educational system in what they need, what they can do, and how to support them in that. We can provide job training and also financial assistance to companies that would hire them but might need a little bit to spend a little bit extra making the facility, for instance, accessible or getting special equipment that the disabled could use. We can enable independent living and inclusive living environments that they could live as independently as possible. Of course, we can continue to lobby and advocate for better enforcement of the laws that protect the disabled, and we can help public groups to do that. We can support, assist, and counsel the disabled individual and their family with whatever kind of support they need and counseling. We should and can facilitate participation in groups and activities with others, because a very key thing in their feelings of efficacy and self-worth and satisfaction is having some kind of social life and connection with others. We can protect disabled rights and safety, of course, work to improve monitoring of their care and educate and monitor for and prosecute abuse and look for signs of it. Let people know what the signs are so that they can be aware of it. And we can advocate and create agencies to occupy the disabled, whether by education, by employment, by enriched daycare environments, by providing whatever it is that they can do depending on what's suitable for the client. The disabled are affected by needs just like everybody else for spirituality, and they can be affected by loneliness. Those are two issues in our coursework, and it's our responsibility to help them deal with this by fostering spirituality, by allowing them to realize how worthy they are, and that their spirituality and helping them to connect. An appropriate quote from Frankel's book: I broke my neck, it didn't break me. I know that without the suffering, the growth I have achieved would have been impossible. This is from Jerry Long, who Frankel cites in his book. He broke his neck and then he went on to go to school to become a professor, I believe, if I remember correctly, and to help other people who were disabled. And it is a fitting quote to end this, because really the disabled are just like you and I. They have something that they have a challenge in, but there are other areas where they have strengths, and we need to start looking to those strengths and including them as much as possible, and that way they will benefit, but more importantly also society will benefit.